Babylon was the center of the world. Its walls rose like mountains made by human hands, so wide that chariots could race upon them side by side. Its hanging gardens defied gravity, cascades of green suspended in the air as if nature itself had decided to ignore its own laws. Its temples touched the clouds, and the priests who climbed their endless stairways claimed they could hear the gods whispering. And at the heart of this invincible empire, seated upon a throne of gold and terror, was Nebuchadnezzar, the King of Kings, the conqueror of nations, the man who had made Jerusalem bleed. His armies had marched upon the promised land like a storm of iron and fire. City after city fell before his legions. Wall after wall crumbled under his battering rams. And when they finally reached Jerusalem, the city of David, the jewel of Israel, there was no mercy. The Temple of Solomon, built with cedars from Lebanon and gold from Ophir, was plundered. The sacred vessels that had served the God of Abraham were carried away as trophies. The riches accumulated over generations disappeared in endless carts heading toward Babylon. And along with the gold came the captives, thousands of them, men, women, children. The elite of Judah dragged in chains along the road of exile, faces covered with dust and tears, feet bleeding on the stones of the path, broken hearts looking back at a Jerusalem that grew ever smaller on the horizon. Among those captives were 4 young men that no one noticed, 4 faces amid a multitude of the defeated, 4 hearts that still beat with a faith that exile could not destroy. They were young men of nobility, educated in the finest circles of Judah, knowledgeable in the law and the prophets, but now they walked in chains like everyone else, breathing the dust raised by those ahead, swallowing humiliation with every step. Their Hebrew names carried promises that their parents had spoken over them on the day of their birth. Hananiah meant, "The Lord is gracious," a declaration that divine mercy was real, even when circumstances screamed otherwise. Mishael asked, "Who is like God?" A challenge to all idols, a confession that no power compared to the Most High. Azariah declared, "The Lord helps," an anchor of hope for the days when all human help would fail. And Daniel affirmed, "God is my judge," a reminder that the final verdict did not belong to earthly kings. But Babylon did not tolerate memories. Babylon did not allow identities that pointed to another god. The empire had perfected the art of erasing peoples. It did not merely conquer territories, it conquered souls. And the first step was always the same: destroy the connection to the past. And so, before they could even mourn the land they had lost, before they could process the trauma of exile, the 4 young men were separated from the multitude. Ashpenaz, the chief of the eunuchs, examined them with calculating eyes. They were handsome, intelligent, without physical defect, exactly the type the king wanted to serve in his palace. And then came the first violence, not physical violence, a deeper violence, a violence against their identity. Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael became Meshach, Azariah became Abednego, and Daniel received the name Belteshazzar. The new names were not random, they were calculated. Shadrach possibly derived from Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. Meshach perhaps meant who is like Aku, the moon god. Abednego meant servant of Nebo, the god of wisdom and writing. And Belteshazzar proclaimed that Bel protects the king. Each name was an invisible chain. Each syllable was an attempt to rewrite their souls. The gods of Israel were to be forgotten. The God of their fathers was to become a distant memory, and in their place the gods of Babylon would reign. But what the Babylonians did not understand was that a name can be changed, but a heart cannot be stolen. And the hearts of those 4 young men belonged to the living God, the God who had parted the sea for their ancestors, the God who had made the sun stand still for Joshua, the God who was still God, even when his temple lay in ruins and his people were in chains. The years passed. The exile that should have destroyed them ended up refining them. The furnace of Babylon, before it became literal, was spiritual. And in it, the faith of those young men was purified like gold in fire. They learned the language of the Chaldeans. They studied their literature, they mastered their science. But never, not for a single moment, did they forget who they truly were. When the king's food was offered, food that had been consecrated to idols, they politely refused. Daniel negotiated with Ashpenaz for a diet of vegetables and water, and at the end of the testing period, the 4 Hebrew youths were healthier than all the others who had eaten from the royal delicacies. God was with them, silently, invisibly, but powerfully. Daniel interpreted dreams that no wise man of Babylon could decipher. When Nebuchadnezzar had a nightmare that tormented him, when no magician or enchanter could reveal its meaning, Daniel stepped forward, and with wisdom that came from above, he not only interpreted the dream, he described it before the king even told it. His wisdom opened doors that swords could never open. And when Nebuchadnezzar recognized the supernatural gift that dwelt in that young Hebrew, he elevated him to a position of honor that no foreigner had ever held before. But Daniel did not forget his friends. At his request, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were appointed to administrative positions in the province of Babylon. 3 foreigners, 3 captives, 3 men who worshipped an invisible God in a land of visible idols. Now they held positions of power at the heart of the pagan empire. The Chaldeans who had been born in that land looked upon them with resentment. Who were these Jews to rule over them? Who were these worshippers of a defeated God to hold positions that should belong to the sons of Babylon? The poison of envy began to accumulate, drop by drop, day by day, and one day that poison would find its opportunity. But what would come next would test everything they believed. Nebuchadnezzar was not merely a conqueror, he was a man obsessed with glory, obsessed with worship, obsessed with eternity. The dream that Daniel had interpreted years before still echoed in his mind like a drum that would not stop beating. A giant statue, a head of gold. "You are the head of gold," Daniel had said. The words should have been a compliment, and they were. But the statue in the dream had parts made of other metals, silver in the chest and arms, bronze in the belly and thighs, iron in the legs, and feet of iron mixed with clay, kingdoms that would come after, empires that would replace Babylon. The head of gold would be followed by lesser kingdoms, and this Nebuchadnezzar could not accept. He was the eternal king. His empire would last forever. Babylon would not be replaced by silver or bronze. Babylon would be gold from beginning to end. And to prove this to the world, to heaven, and to himself, he ordered the construction of a statue that no human eye had ever seen. 60 cubits in height, 6 cubits in width, nearly 30 meters pointing toward the sky like a finger defying the gods. And it would not be made of various metals like the statue in the dream. It would be made entirely of gold, from top to bottom, from head to foot, pure gold gleaming under the Mesopotamian sun, like a second sun planted in the earth, a silent declaration that Babylon had no end, that Nebuchadnezzar was more than a man, he was a god. The construction took months. Craftsmen worked day and night under the whips of supervisors. The gold plundered from dozens of nations was melted in giant furnaces and molded to form that colossal figure. They say the glow of the molten metal could be seen from miles away, that the heat from the smelting furnaces transformed that area into an early hell. And when the statue was finally complete, Nebuchadnezzar chose the perfect location to erect it, the plain of Dura, a vast and open plain where the statue could be seen from any direction, where its brilliance would blind the eyes of all who dared to look, where there would be no way to ignore the message it proclaimed. The day of dedication arrived. The sun rose over Babylon as on any other day, but this was not just any day. It was the day when Nebuchadnezzar would demand the worship of the world. Messengers had been sent weeks before to every province of the empire. The decree was clear. All governors, prefects, councillors, treasurers, judges, and officials were summoned. It was not an invitation, it was a command. And in Babylon, to disobey a command from the king meant death. No one could be absent. No one would dare be absent. And so a multitude gathered before that mountain of gold. Thousands of people, dozens of nations, languages that had never met were now side by side, crowded onto the plain of Dura, looking upward at that monument to human arrogance. The sun struck the statue, and the reflection was almost unbearable. Some shielded their eyes with their hands, others turned away, unable to face such brilliance. And in the midst of that multitude, 3 Hebrew men stood, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. They knew what was coming. The rumor had spread. Everyone would have to bow. Everyone would have to worship. And they had already made their decision, a decision that could cost them their lives. The herald climbed onto an elevated platform. Silence fell over the plain like a heavy cloak. His voice echoed across the multitude like thunder on a stormy day. You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. The multitude listened in silence. Some were already beginning to bend their knees, eager to obey. Others swallowed hard, feeling the weight of what was being demanded, and then the herald spoke the words that transformed a decree into a death sentence. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Burning fiery furnace. The words hung in the air like black smoke. Everyone knew what kind of furnace that was. Everyone had seen the giant structures used for making bricks. Everyone knew that the fire inside them could melt metal, could turn flesh to ash in seconds, could make bones turn to dust. It was not an invitation, it was a sentence. Bow or die, worship or burn. And when the first chords of music sounded, the entire plain bowed, like waves falling upon sand, like wheat bending in the wind, like dominoes toppling in sequence. Thousands of knees touched the ground, thousands of foreheads kissed the earth, but 3 men remained standing. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. In the midst of an ocean of bowed bodies, they were the only islands, 3 vertical silhouettes against the golden horizon, 3 points of resistance in a sea of submission, 3 living challenges to the king's decree. Their hearts pounded, sweat ran down their faces under the scorching sun. Their hands trembled slightly at their sides, but their knees did not bend, their eyes did not turn away, their backs did not bow, and their mouths remained closed in silent worship of the only God who deserved to be worshipped. The music continued. The trumpets sounded. The harps vibrated. The melody that was meant to inspire worship filled the air, and the crowd remained prostrate, faces in the dust, waiting for the music to end so they could rise. The 3 young Hebrews remained standing. Every second that passed made their position more evident. Every musical note that sounded increased the danger. And they knew they were being watched. They knew that decision could be the last of their lives. But they also knew something more. They knew there was a God in heaven who saw everything, a God who had said, "You shall have no other gods before me," a God who was worth more than life itself. And for that God, they were willing to die. But what came next would change everything. Envious eyes were watching them. Chaldean men who had resented the rise of those foreigners from the very first day. Men who had served Babylon for generations and now saw Jews holding positions that should have been theirs. Men who had been waiting for an opportunity to destroy them. And now the opportunity had arrived. Served on a golden platter, they ran to the king. Their faces gleamed with cruel satisfaction as they bowed before the throne. "O king, live forever," they said with honeyed voices, masks of respect covering hearts full of poison. "You made a decree, O king. Every man who heard the music should bow down and worship the golden image, and whoever did not bow down would be cast into the fiery furnace." The king nodded impatiently. Yes, that was the decree. That was the price of disobedience. Why were they telling him the obvious? The Chaldeans exchanged glances. The moment had come, and then they dropped the bomb. "There are certain Jews, O king, whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." Their voices grew louder, more accusatory. "These men have not regarded you, O king." They made a dramatic pause. "They do not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar's face changed like the sky before a storm. Satisfaction gave way to surprise. Surprise gave way to disbelief, and disbelief gave way to fury. A fury that made his eyes narrow and his hands clench into fists. The veins stood out on his neck, his teeth clenched. How dare they? How could they? He had lifted these men from the dust. He had given them what no other captive had ever received: power, wealth, position, respect. And this was how they repaid him: with public contempt, with humiliation before the entire empire, with a slap in the face delivered in front of all the nations he had conquered. "Bring them to me," he commanded, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Each word left his lips like a stone hurled. "Now!" Soldiers ran to carry out the order. The crowd began to rise from the ground, murmurs spreading like fire. Through dry straw. What is happening? Who are these men? Did they really defy the king? They are dead, already dead. And minutes later, 3 men stood before the throne. The entire plain watched them. Thousands of eyes fixed on them, thousands of breaths held. And in the silence that followed, the world seemed to stop turning. Their faces were calm, a calm that made no sense, a calm that irritated the king even more. Their hands did not tremble. Their eyes did not look away. And when Nebuchadnezzar looked into their eyes, searching for the fear that should have been there, searching for the terror that his decrees always produced, he found none of it. He saw something he could not comprehend. He saw peace. A peace that seemed to come from somewhere else. A peace that he, with all his power, had never been able to buy. "Is it true?" the king asked, his voice heavy with disbelief and rage. "Is it true that you do not serve my gods, nor worship the golden image I have set up?" The 3 remained silent. It was not a silence of fear. It was a silence of choice. They did not need hasty words. They did not need excuses. They knew exactly what they had done and why. Nebuchadnezzar leaned forward on his throne. He would still give them a chance. One last chance. Perhaps they had been caught off guard. Perhaps they had not understood the decree. Perhaps they could still be recovered. Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the music, to fall down and worship the image I have made, very well. His voice dropped. It became darker, more threatening, like the growl of a lion before it attacks. "But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." And then he asked the question that would echo through the centuries, a question that summarized all the arrogance of human power, a question that challenged not only 3 men, but the very God they served. "And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" The silence that followed was absolute. The wind stopped blowing. The birds stopped singing. The crowd held its breath. The counselors looked at one another. No one had ever defied Nebuchadnezzar and lived to tell the tale. No one had ever heard such a clear threat and refused to bow. But there stood 3 men who seemed not to have heard, or who had heard and simply did not care. Then Shadrach opened his mouth, and the words that came out were not words of pleading. They were not words of negotiation. They were not requests for mercy. They were words of absolute faith, words that made the counselors step back, words that made the king himself widen his eyes. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." The entire court gasped. The audacity was unbelievable. "We have no need to answer you." Who said that to a king? Who said that to the man who held the power of life and death over every person on that plain? Meshach continued, his voice firm as rock, clear as spring water. "Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us. He will deliver us from the burning fiery furnace and from your hand, O king." Every word was a declaration of war. Not a war of swords, a war of faith against power, of trust against threat, of eternity against the temporal. And then Abednego spoke the words that sealed their fate, words that demonstrated a faith that went beyond logic, a faith that did not depend on outcomes, a faith that did not demand guarantees. "But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods nor worship the golden image you have set up. But if not," three words that changed everything, three words that revealed the true nature of faith. They were not bargaining with God. They were not making a deal. "If you save me, I will serve you." No, they were declaring something much deeper, something far more radical. Even if God chose not to save them, even if the fire consumed them, even if their bodies turned to ash on that plain and their names were forgotten, they still would not bow. Their faith was not a contract. It was a commitment. It was not a negotiation. It was a surrender. And no fire, no furnace, no king could burn it away. Nebuchadnezzar lost control. All the facade of a magnanimous king willing to give a second chance collapsed. His face became distorted with fury, his features twisted into a mask of hatred that made those near him step back. He had given them a chance, and they had thrown it back in his face, in front of everyone, in front of every governor, every prefect, every official from every province of his empire. "Heat the furnace!" he shouted, his fists pounding the throne with such force that the sound echoed across the plain. 7 times hotter than it is usually heated. 7 times. It was not merely an execution. It was a statement. It was a demonstration of power. It was an answer to the question those 3 men had not asked, but that hung in the air. "You say your God can save you, then let us see. Let us see if he can save you from a fire 7 times hotter than any fire that has ever existed." If that invisible God of the Hebrews wanted a confrontation, Nebuchadnezzar would give him one. The furnace roared. Men ran to feed it with more fuel, more wood, more oil, more anything that could make the flames rise higher. The heat began to spread. Waves of hot air distorted vision like mirages in the desert. The sky above. The furnace trembled and rippled like boiling water, and the flames climbed higher and higher, more and more intense, more and more deadly. And then the king gave the final order: "Bind these men and throw them into the fire." The strongest soldiers in the army stepped forward. Enormous men, warriors who had survived dozens of battles, who had killed enemies with their bare hands, who knew no fear. They seized Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with iron grips. They bound their hands with thick ropes. They bound their feet. They did not remove their clothing. They did not remove their cloaks or their turbans. The king wanted them to burn exactly as they were. He wanted nothing to remain of them but ashes and memory. The 3 young men did not resist. They did not scream. They did not beg for mercy. They did not try to flee. Their lips moved in silent prayer as they were dragged toward the flames, words that only God could hear, confessions of faith that only eternity could record. The crowd watched in terrified silence. The music had stopped. No one dared to breathe. Some looked away, unable to watch what was about to happen. Others stared fixedly, hypnotized by the horror. And when the soldiers reached the mouth of the furnace, something terrible happened, something no one expected. The heat struck them like an invisible wall, a wall made of pure death. Their clothes caught fire instantly. Their skin began to burn before they could even scream. The air in their lungs turned to fire, and before they could release the prisoners, before they could take a step back, before they could understand what was happening, they fell, dead, incinerated by the heat they themselves had fed, enormous bodies collapsing to the ground, like trees felled by lightning. But the momentum of the throw had already been given. The hands that opened in death had already released their cargo, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell into the furnace, bound, defenseless, condemned. The crowd closed their eyes. Some turned their faces away. Women covered their faces with their hands. Men, hardened by war, swallowed hard. No one wanted to see what would come next. No one wanted to hear the screams of agony. No one wanted to smell the burning flesh that would surely follow. But the screams did not come. The silence stretched. On 1 second, 2, 5, 10, only the roar of the fire, only the crackling of the flames. No human scream, no sound of pain, nothing. Nebuchadnezzar frowned. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. He rose from the throne. His eyes turned toward the furnace. The light of the flames illuminated his face, reflecting in his wide-open eyes, and what he saw made his heart stop. There inside, in the midst of flames that had killed his strongest soldiers in less than a second, 3 figures were walking. No, 4 figures, unbound, free from the ropes that had tied their hands and feet, strolling through the fire as if they were strolling through a garden on a spring afternoon, as if the flames were flowers and the heat was a breeze. Nebuchadnezzar staggered. His hands gripped the arm of the throne to keep from falling. His face lost all color, all fury, all arrogance. Only the astonishment remained of a man confronted with something he could not explain. His voice came out as a hoarse whisper, almost lost in the roar of the flames. Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? The counselors approached, trembling. True, O king, 3 men bound, cast in. That was what everyone had seen. Nebuchadnezzar pointed at the furnace. His hand was shaking violently. His index finger wavered like a leaf in the wind, and his voice rose to a shout that echoed across the entire plain. I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. The entire court turned toward the furnace, and everyone saw the 4th man, the 4th figure. He was not like the other 3. He shone in a way that no fire could produce. His light did not come from the flames around him. It came from within him. It came from a place that transcended time and space. It came from eternity. He walked beside them as if he had known them forever, as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if the furnace was exactly where he wanted to be. Who was he? Centuries later, theologians would debate this question in thousands of books and sermons. Some would say he was an angel sent to protect them. Others would claim it was a theophany, an appearance of God himself. Many Christians would see there a Christophany, the Son of God himself appearing centuries before Bethlehem, centuries before the manger, centuries before the cross. But in that moment, on that plain, before that furnace, Nebuchadnezzar did not need theology. He did not need academic debates or doctrinal discussions. He only needed his eyes, and his eyes told him that he had encountered a God greater than himself, a God who could not be defeated by fire, a God who walked where no man could survive, a God who was real. If this story is touching your heart, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Here, every narrative is a journey through the sacred pages, and what comes next will reveal what happens when the hottest fire on earth meets the most powerful presence in heaven. Nebuchadnezzar came down from the throne. His legs were shaking, but he kept walking. The crowd parted before him like the sea opening. The counselors stepped back. The guards moved aside, and the most powerful king on earth walked alone to the mouth of the furnace. Every step was a battle. The heat was unbearable. Waves of hot air lashed his face like invisible whips. His skin burned, his eyes watered, but he needed to see up close. He needed to make sure he was not going mad. And when he reached the door of the furnace, as close as any man could come without dying, he did something no one expected. Something that contradicted everything he was, everything he represented. He called the Hebrews by name, not by the Babylonian names he had given them, but acknowledging who they truly were, acknowledging the God they served. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Servants of the Most High God, the king who had asked what God could deliver them from his hands, now acknowledged that God. Not as one among many, not as just another idol in a crowded pantheon, but as the Most High, the highest of all, above Marduk, above Nebo, above Bel, above all the gods of Babylon. And from within the fire, 3 men walked toward the light. Their steps were calm, their faces were serene. No sign of pain, no burn marks, no trace of the horror they should have faced. And when they crossed through the door of the furnace, when their feet touched the ground outside that inferno, the entire crowd held its breath. They were unharmed, completely unharmed. The satraps rushed forward, the prefects, the governors, the king's counselors. Everyone wanted to see up close. Everyone needed to confirm what their eyes refused to believe. They touched their clothes. They examined their hair. They smelled their garments. And what they found defied all logic, defied all science, defied everything they knew about fire and flesh and death. The fire had no power over the bodies of those men. Not a hair on their heads had been singed. Their eyebrows were intact. Their eyelashes had not shriveled. Their cloaks were not burned. Their tunics were not damaged. Their turbans remained on their heads as if they had never entered a furnace. And most extraordinary of all, the detail that silenced even the most skeptical. There was no smell of fire on them, no trace, no evidence, no remnant of what they had passed through. It was as if they had never been in the furnace. It was as if the fire had decided not to touch them, or as if something greater than fire, something more powerful than flames, had wrapped them in invisible protection, a bubble of eternity in the midst of hell, an oasis of life at the heart of death. Nebuchadnezzar fell to his knees, not before his golden statue that still gleamed under the sun, not before his bronze gods that filled the temples of Babylon, before the invisible God who had just humiliated him in front of his entire empire. The most powerful king on earth, on his knees in the dust, looking at 3 former captives whom his fire could not burn. His voice echoed across the plain. It was no longer the voice of command. It was the voice of admiration, of surrender, of forced recognition. Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. For they set aside the king's command and yielded their bodies rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Every word was a confession. They trusted. They yielded their bodies. They chose death rather than idolatry, and their God honored that choice. The words that followed were a decree, not a decree of death, like the one before, a decree of honor, a decree of protection, a decree that proved the king had learned something on that plane. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses shall be made a dunghill. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. The same king who had commanded everyone to worship his statue now commanded that no one speak against the God of Israel. The same man who had asked what God could save them now declared that no other God could do what that God had done. The furnace still smoked. The bodies of the soldiers still lay charred beside it. The golden statue still gleamed under the afternoon sun. But something had changed. something fundamental, something that could not be undone. The God of Israel had revealed himself at the heart of Babylon. The God of the captives had proven greater than the God of the conquerors. And 3 young men who should have died that afternoon walked free, without even the smell of smoke on their clothes. Nebuchadnezzar caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. The men who should have died that afternoon were elevated to even higher positions than before. The foreigners who had defied the king received more honor than the Chaldeans, who had served him for generations, and the very men who had rushed to denounce them were now forced to bow before them. The irony was almost palpable. Those who wanted to destroy them ended up exalting them. Those who planned their death ended up witnessing their glory, and their story began to spread from mouth to mouth, from city to city, from generation to generation. The story of the 3 men who chose fire rather than idolatry. The 3 young men who said, "But if not," and discovered that God was waiting inside the flames. The Babylonian Empire eventually fell. Nebuchadnezzar died. His successors were defeated. The Persians came, and Great Babylon became just another province of another empire. The golden statue was forgotten, melted down perhaps to make coins or jewelry, plundered by later conquerors, lost in the sands of time like so many other monuments to human arrogance. But the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego survived, because some things are greater than empires. Some stories are more enduring than gold. Some faiths burn hotter than any fire. The centuries passed. Civilizations were born and died. Languages were forgotten. Alphabets disappeared. Borders were redrawn 1,000 times. But in every generation, someone told this story. In every age, someone found courage in it. In every moment of trial, someone remembered those 3 men who chose to die standing rather than live on their knees. The prophet Isaiah had written words that seemed destined for them. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned, nor will the flame set you ablaze." Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego may not have known these words when they entered the furnace, or perhaps they did. Perhaps their mothers had whispered them in their ears when they were children in Jerusalem, before the exile, before the chains, before the plain of Dura. Perhaps their fathers had taught them on cold nights in captivity, reminding them of who their God was. Either way, they lived them out. Every syllable, every promise. They walked through the fire, and the fire did not burn them. The flame did not consume them, and the God who had made the promise walked beside them to ensure it was fulfilled. There is a pattern that repeats throughout Scripture, a pattern that confounds human logic. God rarely removes trials. He prefers to walk through them alongside his own. Joseph went to prison before he went to the palace. David fled to the wilderness before he sat on the throne. Jesus himself descended into the tomb before rising again. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego entered the furnace before becoming witnesses to the greatest miracle of their lives. They were not delivered from the fire. They were delivered in the fire. And that difference makes all the difference, because any false god can promise to prevent problems. But only the true God can transform problems into altars. Only the living God can turn a furnace into a sanctuary. Only the Most High can walk where heat kills and transform death into life. The Chaldeans who denounced them saw the miracle. The counselors who expected their deaths saw salvation. Nebuchadnezzar himself, who had challenged heaven with his arrogant question, was forced to bow before the evidence. And everyone learned a lesson that echoes to this day. There is no furnace too hot for God. There is no decree too powerful to be overruled. There is no king too great to be humbled when he rises against the Most High. Empires crumbled. Babylon became dust and memory. Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue was forgotten by history. No one knows where its pieces are, no one visits its site, no one remembers its height or its brilliance. But the story of three men who chose fire rather than idolatry crossed the centuries like a torch that never goes out. Why? Because there are some things that fire cannot destroy. True faith does not melt under pressure. Genuine conviction does not bow before threats. And when someone decides they would rather die standing than live on their knees, heaven itself comes down to walk beside them. They did not know if they would be saved. They said clearly, but if not, still they remained standing. And that is exactly why we still speak of them today, because the world will always need people who refuse to bow. There will always be golden statues being erected, statues of success, statues of power, statues of approval. There will always be music playing, inviting everyone to bow before what the world worships. There will always be voices saying that faithfulness is not worth the price, that principles are negotiable, that survival is more important than integrity. But there will also always be those who, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, look at the fire and say, "Even so, I will not bow." And for them, God reserves something special, not the absence of furnaces, but his presence inside them, not escape from the fire, but divine company in the midst of the flames. Not a promise that nothing will hurt, but a guarantee that nothing will destroy what truly matters. The fire may roar, the flames may rise, the heat may be 7 times more intense than anything you have ever faced. But when God enters the furnace, fire loses its power, and what should have been an end becomes only the beginning of a testimony that will last forever. 3 young men entered the furnace, 4 walked inside it. And when they came out, the world was never the same again. Neither were they. Neither was Nebuchadnezzar. Neither was anyone who heard this story in the 3,000 years that followed. Because once you see God walk through fire, you will never fear the flames again. If this story touched your heart, write in the comments, "I choose to stand."